Grace to you and peace, and welcome to this week's continuing midweek faith formation series as we continue to look at stories that didn't make the felt board. Tonight we're reading another strange and violent tale from Judges, one with gory details more at home in a Quentin Tarantino movie than a Sunday school flannel graph. We'll be talking about the gruesome story of Jael and Sisera. Where are we in the narrative? We're still in Judges, and in fact we're only about a chapter past where we were last week. As we discussed last week, the book of Judges comes after the book of Joshua. Somewhat paradoxically, Joshua describes the complete conquest of Canaan, but then Judges tells the story of the 12 tribes fighting to claim their land. The judges who ruled over Israel weren't black-robed jurists or scholars like we imagine today, but instead the word might better be translated as chieftain. While we're only about a chapter past where we were last week, we are a few decades later in time, after Ehud stabbed the obese King Eglon. And the cycle has repeated itself. Israel has done what is evil in the Lord's sight, and for that they have been handed over to an enemy king, in this case Jabin and his general Sisera. And the 12 tribes of Israel have cried out to the Lord for help. Now, new leaders have arisen to deliver them. Deborah, the prophet and judge, and her appointed general, Barak. After 20 years of oppression under Jabin and Sisera, Deborah summons Barak to hear the Lord's promise. Deliverance is coming. The Israelite general is to take an army and to lie in wait for Sisera at the Kishon River in the north. And there, the Canaanite general and his strong chariots will be defeated. Barak promises to go, but on the condition that Deborah go with him. Deborah promises to accompany him, but she tells him that he will not be the one to receive the glory for the victory. Instead, the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. The Israelite army takes up its position, and Sisera leads his chariots into battle. But on the morning of the attack, Deborah tells Barak, "Up! This is the day on which the Lord will deliver Sisera into your hands." The Israelites get the jump on the attacking army, and the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and army into a panic. And Sisera promptly flees on foot, and Barak is hot on his heels. The Canaanite leader finds a tent belonging to Heber the Kenite, a man who was on friendly terms with Canaan's leaders. Seeking help, Sisera appeals to Heber's wife, Jael, who kindly welcomes him in. She gives him a place to rest, she covers him with a blanket, and she even gives him some milk to drink. Sisera asks Jael to stand guard and to tell any pursuing soldiers that he's not there. As Sisera naps, Jael takes a tent peg, not a small little aluminum peg that you might take camping with you, but a large wooden stake. And she takes a mallet, and she drives the large spike through his skull. Scripture adds the gory detail, until it went into the ground. And being rather curt, Scripture adds, thus he died. Now, as a gruesome point of clarification, most English Bibles say that she drove the stake through his temple. But a few interpreters suggest that the Hebrew should properly be translated through his parted lips, meaning that she drove the stake through his mouth until it came out the back of his head. Either way, he died. And so when Barak finally shows up, Jael goes out to greet him. "Come in, I'll show you where he is." And in walks Barak to see his enemy lying dead with the stake still in his temple. Believe it or not, this is an amazingly common trope in ancient Mediterranean cultures. We'll see it pop up later in the Bible in Esther and in the Deuterocanonical Apocrypha when Judith beheads Holofernes. And the ancient Greeks even had a name for a specific version of women brutally killing men. They called it sparagmos, in which women rend men limb from limb. But first, let's talk about Esther and Judith. Esther is set in the Persian court, and this book tells the story of a cruel king and his henchman named Haman. Haman schemes to murder all of the Jews living in the kingdom, but Esther and her kinsman Mordecai learn of the plot beforehand and foil it. Haman has a large pole ready to string up Mordecai, but it's Haman himself who ends up impaled on the pole. And so while Jael uses her wits and her physical strength to defeat Israel's enemy, Esther uses her position of power and court politics to achieve the same end. By comparison, the book of Judith, like many other books that were at one point considered part of Scripture and later removed, was written after the Maccabean revolt. And it's set in the days before Babylon sent the Judean elite into exile. The book of Judith also tells the story of a woman who rescues the descendants of Abraham. Unlike in the story of Jael, it's Judah that she delivers. Israel as a political state had ceased to exist sometime earlier. But unlike Jael, who is a foreigner, Judith is Jewish, and in fact, her name literally means the female Jew or the female Judean. In the story, she takes on a role similar to both Deborah and Jael. She is the one who comes up with the plan and seeks out Holofernes. And using her beauty as an asset, sort of like Esther, she gains influence and access among the enemy. Judith waits for the right opportunity. After a banquet, when Holofernes was, and I quote the text, dead drunk. As he sleeps off his bender, Judith takes his sword and lobs off his head. Okay, now back to the Greek trope of sparagmos. There are three prominent examples, two of which are set in the context of the worship of Dionysus, the god of fertility and of wine. His Roman counterpart was Bacchus, from which we get the term bacchanal, usually used to refer to a scandalously chaotic party. Now, I don't know about you, and my life has been rather tame, but every party I've ever attended, even the wildest, has ended with the revelers still largely intact. In some myths, Dionysus himself was killed by the Titans, and in the cyclical nature of many myths, his female followers would murder those who refused to worship him. And so, in the story of Orpheus, Maenads murdered Orpheus for worshiping the sun god Apollo rather than Dionysus. In another myth, King Pentheus is lured out to spy on women worshiping Dionysus by the god himself, who is disguised as a woman and promises Pentheus a voyeuristic opportunity. Side note, we are covering some of the weirder, more violent, and sexual parts of the Bible, but even these stories have absolutely nothing on the depravity of Greek and Roman mythology. If we're looking at the R-rated scenes from Holy Writ, the Greco-Roman pantheon is surely NC-17. Now, Pentheus had banned the worship of Dionysus, and so when he arrives at the festival, the worshippers seize him, pull him down from his watching place, murder him, and literally rip him apart. In a non-Dionysian example, the tragic figure Medea murders and dismembers her own brother to slow down those who were pursuing Medea and the hero Jason of Argo fame as they abscond with the Golden Fleece. Okay, so in the Mediterranean world, women in mythology would regularly kill men. But what does all of this violence mean? Well, for one thing, we need to remember that in most of scripture, mythology, and history, women are the victims rather than the perpetrators of violence. Women are more often the object rather than the subject. They are more often acted upon than the actor. But it's also not a secret that the ancient sources, both Hebrew and early Christian and Greek, take a grim view of women. It's Eve who sins first, Sarah who convinces Abraham to abuse Hagar, Lot's wife who turns back to look upon the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Lot's daughters who sleep with him in his drunken state. And that's just in the first half of Genesis. In Greek myth, it's Pandora who opens the box and unleashes all of the ills into the world. And among the ancient Greek philosophers, women were considered to be inferior to men. So Greek myth is not so very different. Wild women are a threat to the well-being of men. They break their bonds and murder heroes in gruesome ways. But the stories of Jael and Esther and Judith flip that script on its head. Today we see Deborah reigning as judge over all Israel. It's Deborah who tells the general Barak what to do. It's Jael who gets the heroic poem sung about her in chapter 5. It's Esther who saves the people. It's Judith who postpones the invasion. And so while large parts of both scripture and Greek myth take a dim view of women as leaders, these stories, along with Miriam's role in the Exodus, tell of women who save the day and deliver God's people. Not because men aren't fulfilling their role. Barak does indeed go to battle. And in the story of Esther, it's her kinsman Mordecai who is instrumental in Esther's rise to power. No, rather, we see stories like this because God's plan to deliver Israel and to fulfill the covenant, to protect God's people, includes both men and women. The God who calls and equips, the God who anoints, the God who sends saviors and redeemers, calls and equips and sends women as well.